If I asked you to change one moment in the history of this sport to have maximum impact on the sport, where would you go? It's time to talk about the Longhorn Network. It's time to ask, how much do you remember about 2010? Cam Newton's leading Auburn to a national championship. That's what was happening on the field. But behind the curtain, there was a guy by the name of Larry Scott. He was then the commissioner of the Pac-12. Or you might have known it as the Pac-10 at the time. But he didn't like that number. He didn't even like 12 or 14. Larry Scott had a vision. And his vision was to take it to 16. These days, that's not a big deal to us, right? We call those super conferences. But back then, no one had spoken the words super conference. And Larry Scott wanted to be first at the table. Imagine that. Imagine a visionary in the now the Pac-12. Imagine the West Coast leading the way in college football. Again, we have a massive college audience, and I think you guys are listening to me and saying, that had never happened. Once upon a time, it was kind of the way it was. And it almost really took hold because they were this close to getting Oklahoma and Texas, and in the process, Colorado and Oklahoma State and Texas Tech and Texas A&M to join the Pac-16, as it would have been. Now, a lot of you remember something happened back then. But do you remember exactly how this happened? Depending on who you believe, this was within an hour of happening. It was done. In fact, Larry Scott had already made the rounds. He had been to most of the other universities you see listed on your screen right now. Again, it was Texas OU, Oklahoma State, Colorado, who ended up going anyway, A&M, Texas Tech. Those were all Big 12 programs at the time. And Larry Scott said, we got them all. There was one hanging chad. There was one holdup. As is usually the case, the program dragging their feet because of the most diva-ish reasons imaginable. Horns up, University of Texas. And Larry Scott thought he had him locked down. And unbeknownst to him, he didn't. Because there was a network in the great Northeast named ESPN who was coming in a side door that Larry Scott didn't even know existed and offering something called the Longhorn Network. Everyone's heard of that now. No one heard of a major network partnering with a university to create a standalone entity just to serve their needs. ESPN comes in and says, we will give you $300 million over 20 years. Stats and Info ran the numbers. They're getting $15 million a year for 20 years to have their own network. Why did that have anything to do with the Pac-12? Well, the Pac-12 was in the middle of building their own conference network. It was a non-starter. You're not coming here and having your own network. We can't have that. We're trying to build our own. Guess what Texas did? They axed the whole thing, and they stayed in the Big 12. My question to you tonight is, what would have happened? We know what did happen. What did happen is the Pac-12 had to hit the emergency backup plan button, which was very underwhelming to say the least. God bless Utah and Colorado. They had much bigger aspirations out there. You didn't get a Pac-16. You got a Pac-12. And then the future was what the future ended up being. Oh, here's the richest part of it all. So, as you know, 95% of college administrative types are incapable of telling you the truth. And in true fashion, DeLoss Dodds, who was then, I think, either was he the president or the AD, Jesse? He was high up at Texas. They asked him, Mr. Dodds, why not go to the Pac-16? Why not be part of the first super conference? And you know what he said? I can't make those kids travel like that. I can't tax their bodies like that. I mean, how irresponsible would it be of us to make the baseball team travel from Lubbock, Texas to Pullman, Washington? The best interest of the kids. That was what was at the forefront of DeLoss Dodds' decision-making as the AD there. Now, a side note, if you do want to acknowledge there were also 300 million reasons for them not to go, maybe that was on the back burner, but I have to take him at his word when the women's basketball team at Baylor and their travel schedule, that was really what made that whole Pac-16 merger fall through. Of course it was. I mean, whomst would push against that? Whomst would suggest anything otherwise? Not I. A&M got shook after this. And not shook out of fear, shook out of being irate about what was happening. To be clear, what was happening is their in-state neighbor that they already perceived to get every benefit of the doubt was also being given their own network by a television partner that they were all supposed to be in bed with. So A&M said, bye, we're going to the SEC. Peace. And they went. And they've had immediate success. There was a kid named Johnny Manziel that came through there really, really quickly and put A&M on the map in the SEC. Missouri also, if you're keeping score at home, ends up going to the SEC. Texas and OU, as it turns out, they also end up in the SEC just a little over a decade later. And so the Big Ten and the SEC, they ended up becoming the super conferences. But what if Texas had gone to the Pac-12? What if the Pac-16 had happened? Do you realize what we're talking about there? I'm pretty sure the SEC would have found a way to survive. They were doing fine. The Big Ten would have survived. They're doing fine. And I don't doubt that they would have watched the Pac-16 becoming a super conference and saying to themselves, we got to do the same thing. The Big 12 would have been swallowed up. Big 12 would be essentially what the Mountain West is right now to you. The Big 12 would have gone the way of the Big East. I have no doubt about that. The Kansas States, the Kansases of the world, the Iowa States, they would have been SOL, at least when it comes to football. I mean, the Big East found a way to survive when it comes to basketball, or at least somewhat survive, but I don't think the Big 12 would be what it is today, certainly if Texas and OU would have left. The other really multi-million-dollar question in my mind is, what would the ACC have done? Because, see, if the Big Ten and the SEC all of a sudden were looking around at viable partners for super conferencing themselves, SEC's not looking at OU and Texas. I'll tell you who they're looking at. They're looking at the Clemsons of the world, the FSUs of the world, the Miamis of the world. I think Miami's a sneaky good fit in the Big Ten, actually. And so what would happen to the ACC? I can't guarantee you the ACC wouldn't have been poached and pillaged. All sorts of things would have happened. But here's what wouldn't have happened. The Pac-12 would not have become an afterthought when it comes to things like the college football playoff picture, because that eventually would have come along. They wouldn't be an afterthought when it comes to media rights, because a conference featuring the California schools and Texas and Oklahoma would have fetched premium dollars in the open media rights market. The Pac-12 would have been at the forefront. They would have been an engine, not a caboose. And I've hopped both of them. You'd much rather be in the engine than the caboose. Several Big 12 schools, though, would have been left out in the cold. The Longhorn Network. Now, look, here's where you can decide for yourself. I think it's been a net negative on the sport. I would have loved to have seen the Pac-12 take their turn leading the sport for a little while. That's why I'm still rooting for something, some prayer, some Hail Mary or a miracle out there to happen where they get their media rights situation figured out so we don't have to watch them just in terms of like college football plate tectonics detach themselves and drift off into the Pacific. I don't want to see that. Pac-12 Pate. I can't see that happen. But it could happen. And something's got to be done. Well, something almost was done. I got to credit Larry Scott for trying. Dude did approximately nothing else right out there, but at least he gave it the good old-fashioned college try there for a little while. Guys, thanks for watching Late Kick. Make sure and leave a comment. I love interacting with you. But most of all, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. That's how we keep all of this free.